the right-left spectrum is messed up from the start. If you've looked at the history of that, it goes back to the French Revolution, and on what side of the king the people sat for whatever group they wanted to be in, just because he says a lot of radical things. He's a very expressive person. So yeah, I guess that's probably one reason the corporate state media likes to call him similar to Trump. And it goes back to more of the socialist planning versus voluntary planning, where essentially you don't take full accountability for the coercive rules that you're making.
Welcome to Teaching Liberty. My name is Stephanie Edmonds, and I am very excited for this episode, not just because of our topics, which are awesome. There is a libertarian who is president, Javier Milei. We're going to talk about him. And then we're going to get into zoning, because something that I've made videos on and a lot of people are talking about is zoning and housing and a lot of things around that. So we're going to get into those topics, but I am very excited because we are going to get into them with Spencer, also known on the platform formerly known as Twitter as Yates_Brutus. So definitely follow him there. And I'm excited because for the last like 2.5, 3 months, we connected on Instagram, and you have been like an invaluable thought partner, particularly on like the economics for like front, like really understanding like the it's like the nitty gritty, but it's also just like the fundamentals, and you're really good at articulating them. So I'm excited for you to have this conversation with me and share. I mean, you get into the comments on Instagram and Twitter, but bringing it over here to YouTube. So thank you so much.
Yeah, definitely happy to be here.
Awesome. And so we're going to talk about Javier Milei today. He is a quote unquote libertarian, which we'll get into and see if he stands up to the actual definition of a libertarian or what's going on with that. But actually, I was thinking if you wanted to share sort of like what's your political bias, right? Like, what are you coming into this conversation as?
Yeah, that's important context. I guess I would consider myself a voluntarist or voluntarist, however you want to pronounce it. It's some kind of in between the spectrum of kind of agorism and anarcho-capitalism, but not necessarily in either category.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. All right. So if you know it all about libertarians, I guess a lot of people probably just know the title libertarian, but like within libertarian, there's a bunch of different sects and highly debated topic when you're among libertarians sometimes about who is what and this and that. Okay, so voluntarism. I mean I identify with that as well. I would say more or less. I think I'm probably a little bit more of like a constitutionalist. Like I'm probably okay with a little bit more government than you. But um all right, so we are more or less coming from a similar perspective. So we will try to, strongman any points that we make, but again, that's why I feel like, what I have to say is good, but there's certain things that that I don't. I'm just like, "Oh, I got to share this with people." So, one of the people I want to talk about is Javier Milei. And actually, I just had a conversation with somebody who was the national coordinator for the universities. So she's a
Oh,
college student and she was organizing their campaign on the university campuses. And so she was giving her perspective and what it was like, some historical political context. But what I like about this conversation is we get into like Malay specifically and his history. So this is really interesting. And listen, Spencer put this whole presentation together, like did all this research. So
I
let's check
started
this
it.
out.
I started it. You worked on it too.
Yeah, I put my little touch on it, but all the research and information, got to give you the credit. So I appreciate that. So yeah, take it away. Tell us, a little bit about what you know about him, and then, I might ask some questions or, ask you for your opinion on how different parts of his history, what they can tell us or how they might impact his presidency.
Sure. Javier Milei, he just was elected president for Argentina. They've had a socialist country for almost 100 years, roughly. Not full socialist, I would say, but very, very close to it. Um, and so it's a big deal in the sense that the media likes to take a kind of hard stance towards anyone that claims to be a libertarian. So whether they say he's a far right or Trump-like, which I wouldn't say he is at all, really, maybe very minor bits. But so it's kind of fighting through the weeds, determining who actually is Javier Milei on the spectrum. What does he support? What does he not support? And as with all politicians, they like to put in window dressing, maybe say some things that might get more attention from others, just to get on the media. He's been on a lot of TV shows and snippets on reels on social media, everything like that.
Yeah, I was gonna say that if you want to see some of these videos, I just posted a reel up over on my Instagram, so go check that out. But he's the chainsaw is sort of become one of his images, right? And it's supposed to be like, I'm chopping down the government, right? We're gonna cut all these departments. On day one, he said that he is going to move the government from like 28 or 23 departments, something like that, down to 8 or 10. So basically in half or more. And yeah, he's used quite explicit language. So I think that must be the only way that you could really make like the Trump comparison, you know? Like he's
The
eccentric.
populism.
Yeah, it's the populism vibes.
Yeah.
Um and the other thing that I just wanted to note there too is it's interesting now how like, it's more the far right that's being demonized, whereas, like, it was always like, you can't have those communists, and I mean, there's still a little bit of that, right?
Yep.
Um, so I don't know, would we be more happy if they just stay socialists? Like our not us, like our government?
Yeah, and I think I've mentioned this to you before, but it's probably good to start out with this. The right-left spectrum is messed up from the start. If you've looked at the history of that, it goes back to the French Revolution, and on what side of the king uh, the people sat for whatever group they wanted to be in. The substance behind left versus right is almost meaningless. I have some thoughts on what different political spectrums you could pick, but in general, I would say like individualism versus collectivism is probably a better spectrum for politics. And he's
Right.
definitely more on the individualism side, not perfect, not fully individual, but more on the
Yeah,
individualism side.
and we'll also have to talk about this more in zoning too, because it's like
Yeah.
sometimes it's like hard to be the pure, like the fundamental libertarian or whatever it is that your ideology is because you're working within certain constraints,
Yep.
right? So unless you're going to have a libertarian revolution, you have to reform, right? And so you make big promises and then I guess Valentina's hope, she said, is that he can at least just stabilize the economy. We're going to get into a little bit more about like how bad their economy is. Um, so she said, you know, just get the inflation under control and then we can talk about how you did it and how perfectly libertarian you may or may not have been later.
Yep.
So, this is just a little bit more about his history. I found this stuff super interesting. If you want to run us through it.
Yeah, sure. He's 53 years old. He was born in Argentina, Buenos Aires. His mother was Croatian. His father was Italian descent. Um, his parents, I guess he didn't have the best relationship with, but his maternal grandmother and his younger sister, he has close bonds.
Yeah. I
So
have to
that's kind of
wonder if
his.
that like kind of like stoked his libertarian vibes as well. Like wanting to be free maybe from a young age. I also find it interesting that his parents, well, I guess these ones said their grandparents came, so they've been in Argentina for a while, but something I didn't realize is how mixed Argentina is. I think a lot of us have this idea that it's, just the natives populations that were there mixed with Spanish, but they have a lot of Italians and, I guess we got Eastern Europeans in there as well.
Hmm. And it's close to Brazil, so they have Portuguese. So yeah, it is pretty diverse, I think. Continuing on here, so he was in a rock band, and he was a goalkeeper as a soccer player, and then he turned into an economist. He
Oh,
got
I
his
missed that he was a goalkeeper. I was a goalkeeper too. I played
oh,
that
really?
was, my, main position. Okay, I like this guy.
Yeah.
I feel like the rock and roll thing, like, gives him credit, like, when I hear this, it gives me more faith that this isn't just some personality that he put on to be like, "Okay, libertarian's gonna be the thing," right? Like, he seems like he was kind of a rebel, like, he was pretty hardcore.
Yep, definitely. I think he spent probably most of his adult life though as a economist. He went to several universities, got his master's, ended up being a professor, focusing on a
Okay.
lot of different things. He's written more than 50 academic papers.
Okay.
Um,
I'd love to read one of them. That'd be kinda cool to go back and see, like 20 years ago, 15 years ago, what he was writing about and how he was thinking.
I took a snippet of one of his chapters that he wrote earlier this year. It's later in the slides.
Oh, okay, awesome.
Yeah.
So we can check that out. Nice. I found this stuff interesting too. Oh no, this one slide got kind of cut off here.
Yeah, he's been on a lot of television and radio. I think he hosted his own radio show as well. He seems to get a lot of attention, kind of like Trump does, probably both purposely and accidentally, just because he says a lot of radical things. He's a very expressive person. Um, so yeah, I guess that's probably one reason the corporate state media likes to call him similar to Trump, like so.
I have to wonder too, like he seems like he's just like I don't know, a little bit almost like he's an introvert almost, even though he, like, forces himself to be wild, you know what I mean? Like, he seems like he's a little or maybe not an introvert, or just like he's kind of socially awkward, but he just, like, works through it and turns it into his, like, thing, right?
He's definitely a weird guy. I also put in the slides if you want to show the picture of the dogs.
Oh,
So
yeah,
he,
I know you're a dog person,
yeah, I'm
so
a
I
huge
was, like, he's really excited. I was like, "Awesome, we're gonna hear about the dogs."
yeah. So like 20 years ago, he had this dog, and he loved him so much that after he died, he cloned the dog. So now he has these 4 dogs, and he named the dogs after some of his favorite economists. So he has like Murray after Murray Rothbard. I forget which one. Milton Friedman. He's got
Okay.
Milton, and then there's one more that I can't remember. It's on the news here.
Yeah, Rothbard,
Robert
Robert
Lu-
Lucas.
Robert Lucas. Yeah.
There you go. So
Yeah.
I don't know, that's a little weird to me because with everything that just passed with COVID and the biotech industry and him just being like it doesn't it's a little like it doesn't seem very ethical to me even if it's like an animal. I don't know. I don't know how you feel about that.
I haven't even thought about the ethics of it. It's just an interesting story, to be honest.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It is definitely an interesting story, and I think it goes to the point of saying that, he's not your average guy. We have a bunch of pictures here that we've been showing that I think kind of show some of that, but I definitely, again, encourage you to go to my Instagram and check out I put together a little reel that includes several different clips of his eccentric behavior, including, his likening for using curse words.
Yep. He does love curse words. Yeah. Yep.
So this is a little bit more about his history here.
Yep. He's been a member. He only really started politics recently, and not even as an office holder, but more of like a campaigner and a supporter of certain parties. The Freedom Advances Party. He was a member of the founding 2020 to 2021. He helped campaign for others. He focused on right here the Argentine Chamber of Deputies. He went into several neighborhoods, talked with people, and then he established this new party in 2021, Freedom Moves Forward, and the Spanish version of that. And I am not Spanish, so I'll let someone else say those words.
La libertad avanza.
Yep.
It's probably not a Spanish accent at all. Anyways, make fun of me in the comments.
This is very opportunistic of him because it turns out he got a lot of support the more that inflation took off, and it just happens to be, another wave of inflation. Inflation always comes in waves. So
So, okay, so when we say opportunistic though, like, opportunity meets, sometimes it's like maybe he is just authentic, right? These are authentic. They had the opportunity. They had one of the best. They had one of the worst lockdowns and quarantines in the whole world. And it's not like, he just got into politics, but he had been doing economics. And the reason he got into economics was because when he was in the 80s, so whatever, when he was in his 20s, they had really bad inflation. And so he was like, "Oh, I'm going to become an economist then." So, I want to believe that he's genuine, and it's more like, genuine will meets the moment, and he had the courage to step up, and maybe he's smart enough to play the game, right? Cuz like that's the thing about myself is like I always like I just feel like I'm not smart enough, or like I don't have the, maybe it's not smart enough. I don't have the demeanor to like play the game, like let somebody else play the game. I'm going to just speak the truth. Um but to play the game, you got to be able to put up certain fronts.
Yep, I feel like most people going into politics are very extroverted. They have to be able to talk a lot of small talk and BS and get around people that really they disagree with, but also make connections, those strong foundations. So yeah,
Yeah.
it's not everyone can do it. I definitely don't think I could. So more of an introvert myself.
Yeah, this is another thing that I found interesting too, was that, again, that makes me think that it really like is this grassroots effort, because it is like his sister and like I guess like probably other people, I don't know, but just like having his sister in it, and it really just seems like, okay, this is a family thing, like, you know.
Yep,
Um
could be. Yeah, his
some
sister managed his campaign apparently. Karina Milei.
Yeah, and maybe it's a story just to like pull at my heartstrings, just like they did, where I'm like, oh, his sister did it. It's probably like a grassroots thing. Um, but again, I've seen people run campaigns at various levels, and when they are truly grassroots, that's how it is. It's your sister, it's your wife, it's your brother, it's your best friend that are your campaign manager. I mean, I don't know who his running mate, Victoria Rue is, or what her deal is, but I mean there were so many um like political organizations and advocacy groups and new things that cropped up between 2020 and 2022 here. So I have to believe it was some extent there as well.
Yep, probably a lot of impetus from COVID and inflation,
Yeah.
using all those opportunities to springboard whatever popularity he had. So
Yeah, their inflation is crazy. We've been complaining here, and I guess you found over 200%. I know she was saying like I think in the last year it's over 120% inflation.
yep,
So,
probably
whew,
depends on how you calculate it. As you probably are aware here, it's the BLS, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, provides a lot of window dressing on it to make it look how they want it to look, and then they have several different categories of
yeah, we
inflation.
We should
Yeah.
do a video on that for
We should, yeah. We could spend a lot of time, but it's very number intensive. So if you don't like numbers, then you might get us bored.
I know, but I feel like you have to at least know, like, even if you listen to something and you don't have a full grasp on it, I feel like you have to at least, like, listen a couple times, try to understand at least the basics, because they use these numbers to manipulate you, right? It's
Mm.
like, whether you know it or not, they're gonna put that number out there and you're gonna have a feeling about it, right? You're like, "Oh, that number sounds good," or, "Oh, that number sounds," whatever it is. Um, so but what do we got else? Oh yeah, so one of the points that I was making when I was on the podcast with Valentina is he's president. He's not a dictator. Um
Yep.
hopefully. So he can't just, put out a commandment or put out a mandate and make these things happen. He can't just swing around his
His chainsaw.
chainsaw, right? Which is like what I kept thinking. I was like, this seems like kind of authoritarian also. Like, I don't know if I want my politicians going around with chainsaws. Um, but yeah, so talk about just some of the things that might stand in his way from achieving some of these grand claims he's made.
He doesn't have a majority in their version of Congress. I saw that. So he's going to have a very uphill battle there trying to get support for some of his policies. And so I think when I went through and I found a pretty good list of his proposals, policy proposals, he does seem to take kind of a negotiation tactic where he says, not every government employee is going to be fired on day one type of thing, which I don't even think he would have power to do. But he does seem to try to take some middle ground to try to chip away at the system. He's got
Right.
all sorts of details on what he wants to start with and what are his priorities. Again, it goes into energy sector, investment, monetary reform, trade, public spending, labor regulations, judicial reform, welfare reform, education. So he goes through each of these topics and covers like generally what he's looking for.
Okay. And so I guess I guess first of all, like, where's that information? Is it on like his campaign website, or is it like a book he published, or?
The article I found, which is on the references page, is from the Mises.org, and it covers his like 13 biggest policy proposals.
Awesome.
Yeah.
So, well, yeah, I was gonna definitely have those links for all the sources of everything that we cover in the description down below. So we'll link that one up. I guess, what do you think, just from looking over them, in terms of him claiming he's a libertarian, to what those policies actually say, given the context of what he's working in, right? Like I said, if we wanted him to go in and be a perfectly principled libertarian, he would be staging a revolution, right?
Mhm.
um,
Yep.
um, but he's decided that the more pragmatic way to go is by reforming. So, in the context of reforming through the system that is there, how libertarian is it? I don't know, does that even make sense? Is that like an moron, or?
I think it makes sense, but it's a spectrum that I'm not even sure you or I could answer. In my mind, just comparing like different versions of politics, is U.S. politics is different than Argentinian politics, but I would just claim more of him as a liberty-minded Republican, almost. Um,
Okay.
and I would not call Trump a liberty-minded Republican. So as a comparison there, he's definitely more liberty-minded than Trump is. But he seems to follow kind of the right-wing populism type narrative that I put Murray Rothbard in there. He's a former economist and political scientist from, well, he died in like the 90s, I think. But he's one of the most popular libertarians, Murray Rothbard. And he had similar strategies to kind of chip away as a reform-based process, as if like a Ron Paul were elected. He couldn't immediately cut everything.
I mean, I wouldn't be mad if he governed like a Ron Paul or heck, even a Rand Paul, you
Yep.
know? So that's exciting. And some other things that I thought were interesting was that his prospective foreign minister announced that they would not be joining BRICS, right? And so BRICS is this new was it economic block of countries. So it's Brazil, what's the R?
Russia, India,
Russia, okay. India,
China,
China, South Africa.
South Africa. Yep.
Okay.
But they've had recently dozens of countries that now want to join them that are basically anti-US, anti-Europe type stuff. Yeah.
Okay, so it's like basically a block that's forming in opposition to Western hegemony.
Yep.
And Argentina said, hey, we're not going to join this.
Yep.
And so what do you think that signals? Or do you think it's a good thing on balance, a bad thing on balance? I guess both in terms of just like pure libertarian principles, and then secondly, just in terms of does it make sense geopolitically? You know, because like you want to be a libertarian, but then there's also I get again these certain geopolitical constraints that may or may not come into influencing you.
Yep.
And some
Um,
of them might be reasonable, you know, like I'm willing to like not be a perfect person because I do think that ultimately you have to make huge concessions sometimes in order to, you know, do the greatest amount of good you can.
yep. In his scenario, from a libertarian perspective, I would say avoiding particularly military alliances, but if you can avoid conflict in economic alliances as well, essentially the libertarian perspective is just free trade. So I don't think if you could somehow join BRICS and whatever NATO or WTI version that they have for the
Right.
US, if you could join all of them, but somehow have free trade, because a lot of them have stipulations on you can't trade with Russia or you'll be sanctioned, or you can't trade with North Korea or we'll sanction you.
Okay. So it's just like by
So
the way that these things are set up, you can't do that.
doesn't seem like it to me.
Okay. Like you could
But
go around one by one maybe, right? And just be like, "Hey, let's set up some sort of just like establish that we trade with each other."
yep. Yeah, so free trade is definitely the libertarian policy. And when he mentioned this on the Tucker Carlson show, he kind of added a qualifier to the end of it. He said initially he was like, "We're never going to trade with Russia. We're never going to trade with China. We're never going to trade with Venezuela." But then at the end of it, yeah, this slide right here. At the end of it, he goes, "But it's up to every individual." So I'm not quite sure. Maybe he's just trying to be radical and then come out with his, oh wait, maybe it is libertarian so that people can trade with Russia if they want to.
Oh,
So
playing both sides here a little bit, playing
maybe.
both sides, you know. So, well, he could also be talking about maybe the government, like maybe the government won't do business with these people. They won't set up trade agreements with them, but any person or any business can do as they please, kind of making that separation between, well, like, I mean, technically our constitution is restricting what the government can do, right? So maybe he's setting that same type of constraint up. We're restricting what the government can do. People do as they please.
Yeah, could be, could be. But from just the basic BRICS, like number one choice or policy, I would say, is trying to get rid of the dollar as the national or international reserve currency, which I fully support. In particular, they've discussed backing it with
So
gold. I
so
don't
you
think that's gonna
support which part do you support? Sorry.
getting rid of the dollar as the international reserve currency.
Okay, got it. So getting rid so that's interesting, right? So it's like you were saying, well, we should avoid these alliances, but like what if joining one of those alliances helps achieve this political goal? Is it like too messy? Is that how you get blowback and you just like there's better ways to do it?
I'm sure there's better ways to do it. The more you can emphasize free trade, where there's essentially no restrictions on
Right.
international or even domestic trade. So,
Well,
but
that's
yeah, the
definitely something I
current
think people Oh, sorry. I was going to Go ahead. You finish your statement.
Yeah, the currency, having a reserve currency is fine, but when it's not backed by gold and it's a fractional reserve system, it only leads to problems. And it makes it easier when you have a trusted currency, but it doesn't have to be fiat. And so that's kind of the issue. And particularly when they can sanction you, like US does it all the time, Europe does it too, but
And
they have the
how would BRICS do it? What would they use as their reserve currency? And would it be gold backed or?
they've been discussing it. I don't think they've made a decision. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. So we should definitely follow with that. And I was
It'll
gonna say too, something that's not particular to this situation, but probably like just more so to the war that's going on in the in the Middle East is that people I feel like they think about things as like communism versus capitalism, right? Or like um but I think it's more about like Western hegemony. Like it's that our the way that we've used our dollar, the way that we've used our military, like the way that we project our power out into the world is not aligned with our, democratic liberal values. And now, we're feeling that deterioration, I think, domestically as well. So just a framework I think people should think about. But I want to wrap up with the Malay section. And the next topic that I kind of wanted to transition to is more domestic. Um, the It's something again I have done a bunch of videos on, which is housing and in particular zoning. So we had talked about this a little bit. I don't know how familiar you are with this happening, but it's certainly happening here in Connecticut. I have a video of some guys out in Texas that it's happening to. I've heard of people in other states. I just saw an article where they changed the zoning to from single family housing to multifamily housing, right? You live in this single family neighborhood, and then all of a sudden, a huge developer is putting up, or I'm sorry, a developer is putting up a huge apartment building. And you're like, I didn't, I specifically moved here because I didn't want this to be a busy road, and now you're putting this 80 unit thing in here. The sewage, the infrastructure. If you live out in a place where there's a lot of wooded areas, it can have environmental impacts. So I saw you laughing at some of these things, like because I know you're like super strict property rights. um but and like I am theoretically too, but I guess it's like again, like working within the system that we have. I feel like sometimes some of these zoning and these restrictions do and it's closer to your local level, so you can have more participation and representation in these types of decisions. um that they can protect the individuals from these big corporations who are able to buy political favors and then, get advantages. So I guess I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I know you had put together again like some great slides on this and some maps that we're going to reference, but if you just want to like kind of tee us up, give us some of your initial thoughts on this whole zoning topic.
so from the libertarian perspective, there's really two core principles. One would be individual consent, and the other would be property rights. So, because each person owns their own body, they own the fruits of their labor. And so, when you buy or exchange something voluntarily or homestead it, it becomes your property, and then you have full control over it. And that's kind of what the difference between government intervention causes a reduction in ownership control. And so if it violates individual consent or property rights, then it is a net harm on both the society and the individual. So it's there's a lot of ways to look around it. Some of it's indirect, some of it's direct, but essentially it's a zoning is a question of urban planning or socialist planning in general. So, who owns the control of resources?
Okay, so you're saying like the whole idea is quite a new idea. Cause I was just thinking like
Zoning,
too, like theoretically, like if you move into a neighborhood and it's like kind of, there's not a lot of houses around and it's you and a few other neighbors. And then a person moves in next door and builds like a huge, large factory, and like there's trucks driving in and out past your kids trying to play, in the front yard or something. Like, is there any level at which you can decide that you want certain things, or people can't do certain things with or that's just like, nah, that's a violation, like get over it, move somewhere else?
yes and no. So you have to use voluntary action. And so I put a lot of examples in history about how they did it before government took over zoning, but essentially it was via voluntary contracts. So if you're selling a house to me, um, then then you'll put in a number of stipulations saying you can do this with the property. You can't paint it pink. You can't put your yard has to be grass. You can't build a second story on it, so on and so forth. And sometimes that occurs with HOAs today. I know they get a lot of negative um, feelings, connotations towards HOAs. I've been in condominiums or apartments that had HOAs, and that they have both good and bad sides to them. Um, but when you have a voluntary contract, you get that benefit of feeling the repercussions of self ownership.
So
So
you would sell somebody the house. Like when you sell somebody the house, it would be in the contract, and then but like if you move away, like that's
then it would so they had covenants, which is a early form of these contracts, a long
okay.
time ago. And neighborhoods, sometimes it was just one house, sometimes it was several houses, sometimes it was um, a very large span of multiple residential, commercial attributes all mixed together in traffic. Um, so it can cover a wide variety of things. But essentially, if it's not voluntary, then you fall into the trap of all central planning problems, which I've laid
Okay.
out. And there's I made a whole slide encapsulating the differences between like a coercive planning, which is socialist planning, or capitalist planning, which is like voluntary planning. Yep, there it is. So the basic failures of any coercive planning or state planning, socialist planning, bureaucratic planning, however you want to call it. You go through von Mises, one of the famous economists. Economic calculation is impossible without voluntary exchange because it distorts the inputs. And so this kind of goes back to prices. A lot of these go back to prices. If you distort the prices, you're somehow distorting the supply, you're distorting the demand, you're distorting the interest rates. You're not able to calculate whether something is going to be a profit or loss to you. And that doesn't necessarily always mean money, because profit is a measure of utility, right? Utility includes both money, but also what you can get out of it personally. So if you consume a burger, sure, you might have paid $3 for it, but you benefited more than $3 because you paid for the burger instead of something else. So you gained the nutrition from the burger, but also the satisfaction, the taste buds in your mouth. You gained utility out of it. So without that free exchange, it's impossible to perform economic calculation. You're guaranteed to cause shortages, whether both on the consumer side or the producer side. And
Which
Mises,
is why we have housing shortages today, right? And so I
yep,
saw this article, which is funny because I saw an article and it was like zoning is the cause of the housing shortage, except their argument was that there wasn't enough zoning. like that everything that they needed to change the zoning, so everything was multifamily housing, basically. Like you can build multifamily housing anywhere. um
yep. I have a slide talking. We can, if you want to go in the supply and demand, we can also do that.
Yeah, so let's go,
Okay.
I guess, like, into some supply and demand. Like, I think that understanding, like, the fundamentals in these ways and going over some basic examples. I guess, if you took economics 101, you probably got this. And I definitely did take economics, but I feel like once you're a little bit older and have some more life experience and forgot what you studied in college, you kind of need to review it so you can be like, oh, yeah, this makes way more sense now that I'm getting ripped off by the
Yep.
government, every day of my life.
Yep. So this is just a basic supply demand diagram, and I included red lines, which would be interventions from the state or the government or a central planner or bureaucrat. And so they can affect both demand and supply for, in this case, we're talking about zoning, but could be all sorts of things. So on the supply side, when you create zoning or any regulation, because this is just another form of regulation, you're restricting the supply. If you don't meet this laundry list of requirements, then you cannot build here, whether it's a height restriction, a parking restriction, a lot size, minimum internal building. You have to have grass, what color you can paint your house, or what type of factory you can build if it's commercial, how many stories. There's all sorts of things they can put into zoning. And as you'll see, there's a lot of discriminatory practices they put into. So there's many ways you can create these supply restrictions where you have to meet these requirements in some board, or maybe you have to go to meetings that are local zoning meetings to get it approved, and it can take months or years, or sometimes just flat out denied. Government owning the land itself reduces supply. So there's tons of ways you can reduce supply, and then there's a ton of ways you can increase demand. So government owning the roads, government owning police and firefighters. Maybe that includes more safety in a particular local area compared to another because government owns that. So that's an increase in demand to move to that particular area. Maybe there's a park nearby. Maybe there's a waterway nearby that government owns access to. So it's an increase in demand. It's not privately held where the owner can decide who has access or not access. Airports, rail stations, any sort of transportation, roads, all of this causes an increased demand around particular areas instead of other areas. Regional demand increases, and so
So
that causes prices to go up.
let me ask a question though. So say can any of these restrictions on demand be caused just naturally in the free market though as well? Like if a bunch of people live in a place and they decide that they want to restrict access to that area
Yeah,
or
if you have a contract in your neighborhood that is uh, very compelling, yeah, there's definitely going to be people that would rather move to your neighborhood instead of the neighborhood next door that has less desirable contract portions of it.
okay.
Yeah.
So you're saying like the contract would be the equivalent of the building codes, the use regulations, the permits. Got you.
Yep. So you
And
could
so the
negotiate
government
all
can't
that.
play that role though at all? Like, I guess, like, you get a little choice you get some choice, right? Like, I could choose to live in this state or that state, this town or that town, and they have different rules and regulations, so, doesn't it work in the same way?
Yeah, you can choose different towns, moving by voting with your feet type of thing. The problem is that it spreads so common that, and it goes back to more of the socialist planning versus voluntarism planning, voluntary planning, where essentially you don't take full accountability for the coercive rules that you're making. So if you make a rule that causes other people harm, you're not paying for it. The government's enforcing that. If you make a rule that helps other people, that's another positive externality that people are getting from you, but the government's enforcing it. So you're having to pay for it. But
Yeah,
if you take, yeah.
I think that's such an important point. That's something I think about all the time is, and even for myself, I'm like, well, the government's supposed to do that, right? Like I pay taxes for the government to do that. Like, why would I do it? You know? Or one that's like particularly kind of like, you know, grabs your heart is when you see homeless people. And I'm just like, I pay a lot of taxes. Like, I know we have homeless shelters. Like, I know we have so many different nonprofits and NGOs and grants and endless things that our taxes go to that are supposed to be servicing these people. And so I don't know, maybe I messed up. Maybe I should give them a few bucks when I pass by them, but I don't know. I don't know. Like, I feel like if we were more and I think that this is also too some of our just like problem in terms of mental health and everybody feeling like it's the end of the world is that nobody's connected to their community. Like you don't have to be. Like the government just provides such a buffer to you having to know who lives next door to you.
Yep. When humans have full self-ownership, then it incentivizes cooperation. But when you have a nanny state enforcing certain policies, creating these poverty traps like you were talking about, you
And
rely on that nanny state dependency to try to do it for you. Yep.
there's something about scale too, is that it just always seems to go in one direction too with when it's the government. I was trying to make this argument before where I was saying, well, like, the towns and the states, they can act as sort of a free market in the way that individuals would. Uh, but the problem is that the scale, it just goes in one direction, right? The state just consolidates power, consolidates power, consolidates power. Um, so really now, what's going on, from my understanding, is that the federal department or the federal government and their justice department are using legislation from the civil rights era. They had a bunch of anti-discrimination housing legislation that went through, and there's been legal decisions since then that have established a concept called disparate impact. And it's basically like if there's a racial disparity, that's because you have racist policies, and therefore we have to use other policies that aren't racist. I don't know, maybe they're anti-racist. I don't think they go that far to use that language though. But you have to, put in more affordable housing and use more government to get rid of this disparate impact, whatever it is, in racial outcomes. So it's very interesting how government power leads to more government power, right?
Yep.
And
The
then
the ratcheting effects described
yeah,
by economist Robert Higgs. He's written
okay.
a lot of economic history about that. In particular, the Crisis in Leviathan book is his most famous one, where he talks about the ratcheting effect, where there's a crisis that may or may not be caused by government, whether it's a war or a disease or
Natural
whatever you want to call
disaster.
it, a disaster. And so only government can save us. So we're
Mm.
going to throw all this power, money to the government, and then they're going to save us from it. And then the ratcheting effect means they after the crisis is over, it goes down, but it doesn't go back to where it was. It's still like 5, 10, 20% higher than what it was previously. They still keep some of that power, some of that
And
money.
then they also get to be like, we helped you in that last crisis.
And
You're
then
going
they,
to need us
you
in the next crisis. Or it was that last guy's fault that we weren't prepared. So we need to make sure I have the resources to get this country prepared for the next guy. Um, but I wanted to talk a little bit more about the discrimination aspect.
yep,
You have a really good slide on that, and then I think that we can sort of wrap up this session. You have so much more good stuff on zoning. I think that we should just like make one of these conversations like just dedicated to zoning. It's definitely a super hot topic. I know basically anybody who's involved in local politics is talking about zoning. So I think it could be super useful information. But I just wanted to pull out again too, because one of the things that I always find myself as like a more liberty minded person, right? A libertarian, if you will, is that there's certain issues where I am more on the conservative side of things, right? And then there's other issues where I find myself more on the liberal side of things. And I'm sort of going through one of these moments right now where people are looking at me and they're like, how are you standing with those social justice people? Da 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 da, you know? And I was never one of the people who would be like, back the blue, because I'm like, I already know that the police represent the state. Like, I'm not out here disrespecting police. Like, like it's the system that we have. I understand it plays a very important role. Um, and yeah, so the like I'm not against the police either, you know? Um, so but I would say I'm also haven't been willing to say that there's not systemic racism, right? Like, I would say that I think that some of the grievance politics that people leverage to gain political power, the a lot of the woke kind of stuff, it is a lot mostly nonsense. But I would say like some of the problems that they're grasping onto at their core ought to be acknowledged, including systemic racism. So is there anything that you wanted to talk about maybe on that sort of broad lens before we zoom into this, or do you just want to kind of get into the specific uh, discriminatory discriminatory nature of zoning?
Yeah, from an economics perspective, discrimination costs money. It costs time, it costs money, it costs less bonds with your community, costs less trade. There's so many downsides to discrimination. And in some cases, some people that have these indoctrinated minds that think because you say a particular thing, you believe a particular thing, your color of your eye or your house or your skin is a particular color, that all of a sudden you are not worthy of whatever this other person that looks like you should have. And when you use the government as a coercive institution to enforce that, that takes away the um, economic incentive to have to cooperate with people. And so if you own a business and you're only going to hire white people, there's a lot of very talented other minorities that aren't white, the non-white people, that could be working for you and doing a lot of great business. And maybe you're even going to take these consumers that would rather have a diverse workforce, a diverse people that are serving them, but instead, you that costs you. If you're a business owner in a free society, that costs you money. But they don't get to feel that. Instead, the state creates these rules that have to be obeyed, or they throw you in jail, or they fine you, or they can even harm you or kill you if you resist. So that's the basics of the economics of discrimination. And so that's
Is there ever a time when a free market, so like on a voluntary basis, would choose to discriminate? Like, what? Because like there's definitely like a sort of like evolutionary, like human psychology to it that is natural, right? Because like when I think of the free market, I'm like, okay, I also think of natural, I guess natural rights, but also just like human nature. I guess that's what I'm thinking of, right? Because like your selfish desires drive your market choices. So how do we kind of square those two ideas? Does that make sense?
Yeah, this cuts down to some more radical topics for libertarianism and around ethics, but individuals have their own personal beliefs and they're allowed to keep those beliefs. But when they get to act on those beliefs is when self ownership occurs. And so they have to take repercussions, whether that decision was a good or a bad one. So if you make a lot of enemies based upon discrimination, your life is going to be a lot bumpier than if you were less discriminatory and more open to cooperating with others. If you even think about where the word barbarian comes from, the ancient Greeks just thought anyone that wasn't Greek is a barbarian. It kind of translates back to barbar, just like they're foreign, so we don't like them. So yes, if you create some forcefully inclusive society, then you're missing out on a whole lot of life, a whole lot of trade and prosperity. And if you choose to do that, so be it. You are welcome to do it. But you get to see the other side of the coin where there's this whole other subset of people that are living a whole lot better than you because you chose to be discriminatory.
Yeah, I was thinking like I guess the only way it would be reasonable on a voluntary basis would be if you like lived on a commune or something like that. Or it's kind of like secluded and isolated in a small community that was away from everybody, right? Because you'd all have to be agreeing to it. And I mean, you could get a decent sized group without it becoming like a state power, right? I suppose. And I guess also like you wouldn't be able to use violence against people who you were discriminated against, right? Like they couldn't come into your shop, I suppose, but you can't. Anyways, going a little bit far down there, but it was just something that was occurring to me when we think about like the free market, right? And I think those are a lot of the arguments that people make is like, well, what if people or corporations, right, groups of people or businesses choose to discriminate, right? Like what are the consequences of that? We need government. And you're saying that basically there's market consequences, right? Like you can only scale so big if you're only willing to work with a certain type of people. You're putting lots of constraints on yourself. So I guess let's talk about that in terms of zoning, because I definitely know that in when we talk again about a lot of the culture wars, like the earlier culture wars were heavily focused on race and Black Lives Matter. And a big argument that people bring up is redlining. And I always thought it was one of the stronger arguments. And but at this, I don't know, a lot of it just like all of it just seems to get dismissed because there's so many other bad arguments and like weird parts of the movement that are going on. So I guess like bring us into housing discrimination and zoning.
Sure. The best book I've read on this is The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, I think is his name, who's a socialist. But so his solutions aren't necessarily what you're looking for, but he does a great job of summarizing the history of what actually happened.
Socialists are good for that.
Yeah,
Like that's what
so
I've
yeah,
always found. They're so good at identifying the problem, but their solutions are shit.
sometimes they do a great job at identifying the problem. So yeah, here's a little example of an advertisement in St. Louis, Missouri from 1916, when kind of the early stages of zoning in official laws were taking place, but essentially they could restrict people from moving into particular neighborhoods based upon discriminatory or racial basis. So it really kind of started, as with many things and problems in America, it kind of started after the Civil War. There was a mass migrations, particularly of former slaves, and they moved out west and they moved up north. And particularly the whites, they didn't like that. So they didn't want them in their neighborhood. They didn't want to do business with them. And in some cases, these minorities, it doesn't have to be all blacks, but they had different European sects too. So the Irish were also not liked. The Jews were not liked. There are several different subsects. The Chinese were not liked. In California, they had highly discriminatory zoning for the Chinese in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So yeah, it's not only blacks here; it's just overall discrimination. But yeah, there multiple instances of using government zoning to preclude people from moving to a particular area or even doing business with a particular area. Everyone's heard of the Jim Crow laws. You had to have separate bathrooms, separate places you could sit on the bus, separate places you could drink water, any of that. But here's just some examples here. It was from local all the way to national. So Baltimore, Maryland, 1910, adopted an ordinance to prohibit blacks from buying homes on blocks with white majorities and vice versa. So if you were white, you couldn't move into a mostly black neighborhood. Similar, Indianapolis in 1926, Orlando suburb of Apopka in 1929 adopted an ordinance banning blacks from living on the north side of their railroad tracks and vice versa. And then on the national side, that book I mentioned, The Color of Law, does a really good job describing all the nuances here. But the Federal Housing Association was created in 1934 as part of the New Deal legislation, which I know a lot of statists today, both on the right and the left, Republicans and Democrats, love to talk about how great the New Deal was. But this is just one more example of how bad it was. You take national planning, and all of a sudden, banks start responding to they're only going to give out loans, mortgages, if the government guarantees it. Well, that's nice. I could get bailed out if government backs me up from this loan. And not like that has any repercussions from 2008 or with this student debt crisis right now. But anyway, Federal Housing Association, a lot of subsidiaries of it, but they had to have specific zoning restrictions in order to get approved from the FHA. So yeah.
So let me ask now, theoretically, if this block of houses right here, right, say everybody that was living in there was white, and they all agreed that they're not going to let any black people move in, right? Like they sign one of the compacts or something. So I mean, it's just this block, right? Versus like the state or the city. Again, we talked about having this scale. My question is like, like all it takes though is like for one person to be like, "Hey, I'm done with this agreement. I'm selling my house to a black family or to a Chinese family or whatever other racial group it is." Is that kind of an accurate way to describe why voluntarism, like, okay, sure, it can sometimes discriminate, right? There can be discriminatory things that people agree to, but you can see also how easily such an agreement can be broken.
Yeah, so breaking a contract is not so simple as I'm just not going to listen to it. There's probably repercussions to breaking a contract. But just inside a silo, it's more difficult to see than from like the bird's eye view. So maybe this one neighborhood has a racial exclusion, but a neighborhood 2 miles over doesn't have a racial exclusion. And so you can look at the price differences. So maybe that is a highly desirable trait to want a racial exclusion. So maybe your house's prices go up, and maybe some people like that, maybe some people don't. So that'll like also exclude poor people that can't live there. Or maybe it's vice versa. Maybe people like having a diverse neighborhood. So all of a sudden, if all of your house prices are dropping by 90%, I'm willing to bet most people are going to be upset, and they're probably going to reduce some of those restrictions. So there's market incentives to meet the consumer demand.
And do you think, like, generally speaking, I mean, it's hard to know because there's not really been a point in history where there hasn't been like government intervention to know, but like
I mean,
it is hard to imagine that over time discrimination would, I guess, like it depends on what type of discrimination, like racial I don't know. Yeah, I guess I have to think about it a little bit more because there's plenty of neighborhoods that are like super rich and like richy, and you're like, oh, those people, but like those people also come out into the world, you know.
yeah,
Um, and I don't really want to live in their neighborhood anyways.
yeah, we'd have to talk about more history because there were examples where zoning was not enforced by government. It was basically a voluntary thing. So, but there's a lot of nuances there, and since we're constrained by time here, we probably don't want to get into too many. But if there's one you want to talk about, yeah, we can.
Yeah, sure. Well, why don't we just close out with maybe one of these examples where you're saying maybe we do have a little bit of a basis for making some hypotheses about what a free market system would lead to.
Yeah, let's pick the Chicago district. Slide 34.
Gotcha.
In Chicago, they created this central manufacturing district, which was a fully privately owned district in Chicago from 1902 to 1964. Frederick Henry Prince started buying up land in the early 1900s. He had been a financier and a railroad magnate for a while, and he created essentially his own district for commercial use. And there's a lot of promise around it. So they covered everything you could think of that you would need for a commercial society. Streets, sewers, railways, stockyards, docks, buildings, construction, finance, traffic agents, engineers, architecture, lighting, airways, so you can breathe and have clean air, sidewalks, water, heating, healthcare, fire safety, cleaning, insurance, security, so they didn't need police, waste disposal, communication networks, even journalism and advertising. So they covered basically everything you would need in a commercial society, and it was all privately enclosed.
Did people
And
live there too? Was it like people lived there, it was like its own little city, or was mostly just business district or manufacturing?
so people, there weren't really houses there, but they provided some housing in some cases.
Okay, got
And
it.
that
And
kind
how
of
big
goes
is
into
this
the
area?
labor. Um, you'd have to look at a map because I'm not from Chicago. I've been there a few times, but
Okay.
it's pretty big. They
Okay.
had, uh, did I put the exact number of acres? No, I didn't. It is very large, a good portion of Chicago. And so in terms of, you could just think about it in terms of population if you want. By 1923, 48% of Chicago's population lived within 4 miles of this district. So almost half the people in Chicago lived within 4 miles because it was just the place to find a job and do work. Um,
Okay.
and so,
And
yeah, go ahead. You
yeah,
had a
I was
question.
just gonna say, and so I know one of the biggest pushbacks you always hear from people is like, well, don't you want to make sure that your neighbor's wires are done correctly so that their house doesn't catch on fire, then catch your house on fire, right? Don't you want to make sure that the building you're going into for your appointment, the pipes don't explode or whatever, the thing is, that we need a government apparently to do for us. You're saying that it's in the self-interest of the businesses and the people that use these to create their own systems where I guess it's done through a system of contracts. Like, did this guy, Frederick Henry Prince, have some special position where he got to make decisions over these things, or like was it fully anarcho-capitalist for any of the businesses that moved in there?
So it developed over time. He wasn't a dictator by any means, but he kind of just worked cooperatively with the people that wanted to do business there. So he would lease out all the buildings, all the factories, and all of this infrastructure and service wasn't built on day one. Obviously, he invested a lot of money into it, and he made money off of it. Um, but yeah, he was able to lease out the buildings, and it was a very convenient way for these businesses to work together because a lot of these have synonymous beneficial methods of working with each other. So if you create some sort of widget in a factory, you need to sell it, and maybe they have services to help you sell it. You also need to transport it. So each of these railways would connect directly up to the factory and send it out directly out to the docks or the national railways.
And this stuff
Yeah.
happens. I mean, even within our market, as unfree as our market is now, we certainly see different areas of the country, or certain cities that become focused around a particular industry. Now, sometimes that's artificial because it's like a big government military contractor or something, and there's a military base there, and so they all go there, or whatever the case may be. So, but we can definitely see how these might work if there was less constraints, right? I don't think it's a totally foreign concept to us.
Yep.
Um,
And they tried to help the people too. I put a section about labor in there because that's what most people these days. Well, how did the workers do? So they were able to include and exclude people based upon the conditions that they created, which was are you a steady worker and are you peaceful? Beyond that, it was basically just be your own person. For the people that were really good workers, they even had welfare systems. They had cheap housing they'd set them up with and lounges, and eventually they'd grow in management and different promotions to actually be more higher in each company, or even start their own business within these leased out buildings. So,
it-
yeah.
why do you think then? Why do you think the incentives were to support workers, whereas previously there hadn't been? It doesn't seem like there was that type of incentive necessarily for factory owners to provide those types of things.
Because of competition. So government creates a lot of restrictions on where people can work, what type of labor they can do, how much they have to be paid,
But were
the
they doing
taxes they
that
have to take out.
like back in the 1700s? Like, I don't know. Wasn't there like, or am
Well,
I, or do I not know the correct history? Because like I know, I used to teach like the early modern, or the turn of the Enlightenment, and we used to talk about the factories and the growth of factories. And in the beginning, I didn't think there was a lot of regulation, right? They used to have like little kids in factories and stuff. And like the conditions weren't good and they would like abuse them.
So it depends on where you're talking about. And I have another example in here about England, which had, for a period of time, mostly free zoning. But yeah, there were some really terrible conditions where essentially people were moving to the city without any knowledge about what they could do, what they wanted to do, and whether uh, enforced via government or like almost a feudal system where aristocrats were able to control who could come in and who couldn't. It restricted options. But if there's so much competition as a laborer where if you get treated badly at one place, you can walk across the street the same day and get just as good or a better job next door. That's the type of conditions that breeds gradual improvement in both wages and also just conditions of satisfactory employment. Not working 12-hour days, 14-hour days, 7 days a week, not having to deal with certain safety restrictions like the textile factories that caught on fire a lot in the New York area. So yeah, this basically, the more you can compete with businesses, it becomes a consumer driven and employee driven market.
Right. Rather than like, oh my God, the government man is going to come in and check on me. And then also I was thinking too, I think in England, one of the big pushes was like the Enclosure Acts, which was like where they took away like public use land basically that everybody could use. So there was that factor, which was less than a free market, making like pushing people to the city, creating just an endless workforce. So messing up the supply and demand of the workforce, I guess, was something I wasn't accounting for. But that's why you're here to bring it back to the basics, and your history knowledge is on point, of course, too. I'm always impressed by the number of books that you've read and the names of the authors that you can just pull out there. I've read a bunch of books too. I have a bunch of books behind me, I promise. You know, I read them at one
I'm
point.
always learning. There's never enough to learn about. So
Yeah, and we still have like a bunch of slides on this deck to go through. This story about England, I definitely want to hear about. So we'll have to, get together again and kind of pick this up and do a zoning part 2 / like really just its own whole standalone thing. Maybe we can connect it to some current events that are going on, because I do think that, like I said, that this is a battleground that I think it's an important discussion to have. Okay, this is the libertarian, philosophy at its core, that if we lived in a totally free society where we are free to make contracts, how it would be. Okay, now how do we most reasonably apply that within the constraints that we have today? What's the best outcome that we can get politically, in a reform? I mean, unless you just want to stage a revolution, then let me know. I'm just kidding. We're not there yet, guys. I mean, it's how many more years do we have? It's the second longest period of history we've been since we've had a constitutional amendment. The other one was the period leading up to the Civil War.
Mm.
So,
yeah, we'll talk about the Constitution another day. I'm anti-federalist, strongly against the Constitution.
Yeah, the more and more I learn about that, I feel like they really push you to be Federalist. Like basically everything you read and take, everybody's like, oh yeah, the Federalist, the Federalist, the Federalist. But the more I read about it, I'm like, I'm pretty sure I'm an anti-Federalist too. Like Jefferson was the man. Like
Jefferson, amongst many others, there's a great book called Cronyism by Patrick Newman, where he kind of describes a number of the issues in early America. But yeah, Jefferson and Madison and a number of the founders were kind of two different characters. One before they got in power, and once they got in power. But
yeah. I mean,
Yep.
It's interesting how I think we're at one of those times though right now where we sort of have to be like, hey, what is the broadest principle on which we can all unite? And then, then we can squabble over some of the details afterwards. So I think that this has been an informative discussion. I hope everybody out there has too. I forgot to say it in the beginning. Make sure you like this, subscribe to the channel. If you're new here, leave us a comment. Let us know what you think about any of the topics we discussed in here. What questions do you have? Hey, maybe you want to fact check us. Definitely fact check us. Let us know what we got wrong. Let us know how we suck. Let us know how beautiful our faces are. So we're here for it all. This is a free speech platform. At least me within YouTube, so I can't really control what they do. Yeah, all that good YouTube stuff. And check in soon. We'll be back for more economics. I think it's history, but also it's economics. And I think that these are the basic foundational principles we all need to be reminded of, because those people on the TV and the news and the experts, they throw numbers at you and they say them confidently and they do it with swag, or they do it in this like populist manner and they catch your attention. And that's all good and well, but we need to be able to ask the good hard questions and know what we're talking about, be dangerous enough. I feel like that's kind of I'm good enough at just being dangerous enough, and then I need people to like fill in some of the more complicated stuff. But appreciate you. Guys, make sure you follow him. I mean, boom, that way at Yates Brutus on Twitter. Follow me and have a good night.
Come on.